But if you're going from night to day, then maybe you don't want to just continue using the fee that you're using. If you're just thinking, well, I'm going to rebrand the podcast, well, if you have a Facebook group, that's going to change. If you're rebranding to something new and exciting, you might want to use a different headshot on your social media profiles. But I think the biggest ones right off the bat are you got to do the podcast logo, intro, outro, trailer. I'm thinking about searchability and then recognition. The logo is the first thing for sure. If you haven't done a trailer, that might be something worth doing. The thought behind the trailer is it gives somebody a 3-minute glimpse into whether or not they're going to like the podcast rather than them listening to a whole episode. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode number 130, a very important lesson from a breakthrough session that I did, and I will keep sharing those as I experience them and have the opportunity to talk to all of you amazing people. Today, for episode number 131, Rebranding 101. So yes, right off the top, this is going to be kind of a niche episode because if you're not going through a rebrand, maybe it won't be valuable. I don't know. I do think there will be value regardless because what you need to do during a rebrand might touch on some things that maybe you're not doing yet. So I would suggest listening either way, but this can definitely be something that you come back to in the future if you do decide to rebrand. So I'll never forget, we were talking to one of our mentors, and he said, the name of your podcast sucks. You guys are really good interviewers. You ask great questions, but the name is just terrible. And at the time, the name was the Hyperconscious podcast. And I remember thinking, I love that name. I want to keep using it. I don't want to change it. But we started to think about, well, if we were going to rename our podcast, what would it be? And eventually we got to the place where we said, you know what, maybe we should do this. Nobody really knows what hyperconscious means. We need a new logo anyway. Let's really sit with this and see what comes up. Eventually we landed on Next Level University, and then we did a rebrand, and I guess for lack of better phrasing, the rest is history. But I know a lot of people get nervous when they're doing a rebrand. What do I need to do? Do I keep my old feed? Do I start a new podcast? Where do I start, really? And we're actually doing a rebrand for someone that is a client. So I figured, okay, well, I might as well just use the list that we created, go through an episode about what needs to happen, and then that way everybody can kind of have a place to start. So first thing right off the top, if you're rebranding, let's say you started a podcast 6 months ago, and at this point you only have 30 subscribers. I would probably, and let's add this too, you're not going from talking about baseball to talking about medicine. You're not changing a ton. So maybe the rebrand is just, I just want to change the name. That's a rebrand. Or maybe I want to go in a slightly different direction where I was talking about parenting, and now I'm going to be talking about parenting for entrepreneurs. Not that crazy of a switch. But if you're going from night to day, then maybe you don't want to just continue using the fee that you're using. But this is my thought. One, if you do a good enough job of letting the audience know that the podcast is going to be changing and the content is going to be changing, that might actually be better for some of your listeners. They might actually be more aligned with the new content. Two, that gives people who aren't aligned an opportunity to unsubscribe if they want. But you've already built up some level of subscription. So following, subscribers, followers, same thing. So for most people, unless it's completely different, I say you just stick with your existing podcast and you change the name. Everything's already set up. You already have all your stats. You already have subscribers and followers. To me, it doesn't make sense to start brand new unless you're doing something completely different. So that's one of the most common questions I get is, do I start from scratch or do I just continue what I was doing? As long as it's in a similar realm, I would continue doing what you're doing. So for us, we went from kind of self-improvement, deep conversations to self-improvement kind of for entrepreneurs for a very short time. And then we decided, you know what, entrepreneurs isn't it. We want to talk to people who are dream chasers, people who just want more out of life. They don't necessarily want to start businesses. And that became our sweet spot. So for me, it just made sense to rebrand change the name, do the artwork, all that stuff, and then keep the same feed. So that's part one. Part two, when you rebrand, you can unfortunately expect there to be a potential dip. So when we went from Hyperconscious podcast to Next Level University, I think that was the first year that we didn't grow from the previous year. That was the first time we didn't see yearly growth. And I remember being nervous of like, oh my goodness, what have we done? Did we mess it up? Now, I'm very glad we did that because this brand is way more aligned than Hyperconscious was. But there definitely was a dip when we went from Hyperconscious podcast to Next Level University. That might happen to you as well. Why? Well, some people might unsubscribe. If people didn't listen to the previous episodes about why you switched, and then they see the fact that this new podcast dropped an episode and they don't know what the podcast is, they might not listen. There's a lot of things that can happen, right? There's obviously a lot of things that can happen. But if you do believe it is better for you to make this switch and you think it's more aligned with the direction you're going, I think you just have to bite the bullet on that, because what's the alternative? You just pretend to be something you're not for longer. It's probably not sustainable. So those right off the top are two things I just want to throw out there. All right, so what do you need to do? Let me pull up my list here. All right, 1, podcast logo. So the logo that's used on Apple and Spotify, your square logo, you're obviously going to need to update that, right? That's 1. Everything is kind of built off of the logo, at least for us. So when we do a logo, we use that logo as inspiration for the YouTube header. If the person has Facebook groups, new headers, that type of stuff. But everything comes from the logo. So logo is number 1. Number 2, YouTube header. If you're on YouTube, you're going to want to change your header to make it aligned with the new brand. Number 3, for audio, intro, outro, and most likely trailer. Because I like to have a kind of a line in the sand that says, hey, this is why we're the new brand. I like that. And if you didn't do a trailer, maybe this is a good opportunity for you to do your first trailer. All a trailer is your first quote-unquote episode, but it's like 2 to 5 minutes. And it's just a little bit of a longer intro where you're saying, hey, welcome to this podcast. This is the problem that we solve for this person in this unique way. I'm your host. These are my credentials. And here's a little bit about why I started. I think that's really good for a trailer. And just think of a movie trailer, kind of the same idea. You're telling people what they can expect. So I would suggest doing that. And if you haven't done a trailer, that might be something worth doing. The thought behind the trailer is it gives somebody a 3-minute glimpse into whether or not they're going to like the podcast rather than them listening to a whole episode. And depending on I'm pretty sure all hosts have this, you can literally, when you upload it, under episode type, you can choose trailer. And that means it'll always be one of the episodes that's easy to access. Whether you have 1 episode, 100 episodes, 1,000 episodes, it'll always be easily findable. So that's something I would suggest. If you have a website, you're going to have to update the website, whether that's the actual page name, whether it's the branding, whatever it is. If your website is named your name and not your podcast name, then you don't have to change the name, but maybe the logos, the artwork, that stuff. If you have a Facebook group, you got to change that header. And I'm 99.9% sure that's a different size than a YouTube header. If you're using Calendly to book guests, you want to change your Calendly logo, which I think is a circle logo. If you are using your branding on social media for any of your social media pages, for like the circle logos, for highlights, any of that stuff, you're going to want to change that. Same thing for YouTube. So on YouTube, you have the little circle logo. You're going to want to change that as well. And that's kind of it. Now, easier said than done because this requires graphic design and all that stuff. But I think the biggest ones right off the bat are, obviously, you got to do the podcast logo, intro, outro, trailer.
What's going on, guys? My name is Austin, and I've been working with Kevin for a few months now. If there's one thing that I find super valuable is his expertise on how to position the podcast to the right audience and fit the content into the overall business plan. And frankly, when we work together, he challenges me a lot. There were some tough conversations that he initiated with me so that I can really grow in the business. Besides the coaching part, the editing team does amazing work with editing and show notes and staying on top of all communications. Overall, my experience working with Kevin has really been top notch.
Outside of that, you can kind of do the other stuff as you go. It's not the end of the world. But I'm thinking about searchability and then recognition. The logo is the first thing for sure, because you can't change the logo until you have the new name. If you're rebranding that way, you need that obviously to do the artwork. If you're just updating, then you can just update all of this, and maybe you don't have to update the intro, you don't have to update the outro. But I think a lot of people set it and forget it when it comes to this stuff. So that's why I said at the beginning that maybe even if you're not planning to do a full rebrand, I still think it's beneficial to look at this, because we have done several versions of our intro. At some point, probably Q1 2025, I'll do a new intro for this show. I'll do a new outro. I'll rebrand some stuff just because I know more than I did when I started. And I'm more comfortable in this capacity than I was at the beginning, so I might as well make the content better. We're always focused on improving the long-form episodes, but most people record their intro once, they record their outro once, they record one trailer forever, and that's, for a lot of us, the first opportunity we get to impress somebody. So that's something to think about at least. And maybe you're not doing a full rebrand, but maybe you want to update your logo. Is there anything else we could update at the same time? That's something to take note of. The strategy I would take is, depending on how many episodes you're doing, so if you're doing one episode per week, I would probably do at least a month notice, where 5 episodes before you plan on doing the rebrand and plan on it being live, I would start telling your audience that that's going to happen. And you can explain why. You can do a full episode on that. I would make it a bonus episode, not a standalone episode, because it's not necessarily quote-unquote valuable. But if you tell your audience, hey, just a friendly reminder, as of February 1st, this show is going from whatever. It's going from everything about dogs to the Petcast. Cool. And here's why. Because I realize that I like talking about other animals as much as I like talking about dogs. Cool. Say that a couple times. Let's do that for the next month of episodes. That way at least people know. You can talk about it on social media. If you have an email list, you could send an email. So there's a lot you can do to be proactive. And that's one thing that I don't think people do enough of. It's usually something that happens very quickly. Like, okay, let's do it. Let's get everything done, and then we'll just let people know after. I think if you're proactive about it, you probably have a better opportunity to not lose people. Now, again, if the content's not aligned, people are going to leave, as they should. But if you're not making that big of a change, then I don't expect a ton of people will leave, but you might see a dip. And that's kind of it. That's kind of it from my perspective. Again, if you're doing an upgrade, do the logo and look at the intro and outro. That's a good place to start. But anytime we've ever done anything with a logo, we always do the Facebook group, we do the YouTube header. So there's a lot and very little at the same time. I think it's less than people think from a barrier to entry and being intimidated, but I think it's also more than you might expect in terms of how things connect. Because if you're just thinking, well, I'm going to rebrand the podcast, well, if you have a Facebook group, that's going to change. If you're rebranding to something new and exciting, you might want to use a different headshot on your social media profiles, and you want that to be aligned with the brand. So there's a lot that can go into it depending on the depth that you want to get into. But that's probably where I would start. And again, you can find someone on Fiverr, you can find someone on Upwork. There's a lot of stuff you can do with Canva by yourself now if you're making logos and stuff like that. I'm sure Canva has a podcast artwork template that you can work with. So there's a lot of opportunities to do it on the cheap or do it yourself. I think it's always good to get some experience with that. But that's where I would start. And See what happens. It's always weird, especially if you say the name of the podcast in the intro and you go from saying one name to saying another name. That can get weird, and you might mess that up a few times, but it's probably not the end of the world. Another thought is if you are using Podmatch, Matchmaker, any of those services, you're going to have to rebrand that. Maybe it's just the name and the artwork. Awesome. But if you're going in a different direction, then you're going to have to write out the about and the types of guests you're looking for and all that stuff. Now, it doesn't have to be done. You don't have to do it all in one sitting. If you know you're going to rebrand, you can start doing the stuff behind the scenes right then. And you can potentially just keep doing the podcast the same way you've been doing it for the next month as you're doing the rebranding behind the scenes. That's something. And then when everything is done, you've already given your audience a month's notice, maybe even more if you can, then we can, on one day, we can change everything. But it doesn't have to be done all exactly at the same time. I think whatever is the most sustainable for you. In an ideal world, you would do it all behind the scenes, and then one day everything would change. Cool. Realistically, if you can't do that, just focus on the most important things. And that's the logo, number one. I would say intro, outro, trailer, number two. And then as you get to the other stuff, you get to the other stuff. So that is where I would focus. If you need help with a rebrand and you want to chat about it, I'll have my link in the show notes. Again, it's a free 30-minute breakthrough session. We can literally spend the entire time talking about a rebrand. I can help you come up with names, help you figure out who the audience is, 10-word description, 25 problems, 25 buzzwords, whatever. So I'll have my link in the show notes for that. I think I also will have the link for StreamYard if you're looking for a platform to use, Buzzsprout, which is the host that we use, and then Podcast Growth Nation, a group for like-minded podcasters who want to get better at the art as much as they want results from podcasting. I think that's something that I didn't necessarily realize about me that I am more and more. I like talking about developing skills. So that's why I have episodes on speaking and interviewing and that type of stuff. I like that because I think that does a lot for you as a podcaster. So we have questions that I ask all the time in there. I do lives essentially every week, but I will really be ramping that up in 2025. Right now, it's very early and very new. So we'll have the link in the show notes for that as well. And if you're looking for a group of other podcasters, that is a great place for you to be. I hope you had, because this is dropping next week. I hope you had a Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas. I hope you are going to have a Happy New Year if you're going to celebrate that in some way, shape, or form. I appreciate you all very much. Another year under the belt. It's been a very, very good year. And one of the reasons is because of each and every one of you who listens or watches this podcast. I appreciate that very much. I know a lot of you are in the Next Level You community. Again, I appreciate that a ton. I've had the opportunity to coach many of you, do podcast breakthrough sessions with many of you. So here's to another year of success. Here's to another year of growth. And here's to another year of podcasting. That is what I will leave you all with. As always, keep on crushing it. Keep on podcasting. And we will talk to you next week, which will almost be next year. I can't say that yet. Talk to you then.